Hello, and welcome to a Roaster's Guide to Coffee Varieties and Cultivars. Today's session will cover a number of major cultivars commonly grown across the coffee growing world, and they are broken up into 4 essential categories: traditional varieties, selections, mutations, and hybrids. We'll start out with a couple of traditional varieties, plant types that I would consider serendipitous selections, born of circumstance or necessity. In Ethiopia, it's possible to argue that there are indeed some heirloom traditional varieties that are still widely being grown, although landrace, I would say, is maybe a more precise and better term for these. Ethiopia is also hardly bereft of agronomy research. Critical gene banks of Arabica are kept at the Jimma Agricultural Research Center, that would be the JARC, as well as 2 fields maintained by the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute, the EBI. And JARC in particular has been pretty proactive in selecting and breeding cultivars that are widely cultivated also. Thus, the blanket heirloom designation for this origin does a disservice to the wide array of genetic variation and significant work steeped in Ethiopia's forests and mountains. Many of these so-called indigenous heirloom varieties are in fact hybrids or selected cultivars. These are surprisingly well documented and recently put to a concisely organized and publicly accessible format. Perhaps you've already picked up a copy of Get to Bekele and Timothy Hill's work, cataloging over 100 pages worth of coffees grown in Ethiopia. If not, I would definitely recommend adding it to your library. There's some great information in there. Some of the most common varieties that I often see perhaps would be Wolisho or Kurume. Those are both coffees that are widely grown in southern Ethiopia near Yirgacheffe. The pronunciation sometimes varies and spellings aren't always consistent for many of these. But these are indeed more cultivated variety and less of the sort of heirloom designation. And if you want to learn more about that heirloom designation, that's definitely discussed in further detail in the previous session on coffee plant types. Sudan Rume is a pretty interesting variety. Sometimes it's written inverted, Rume Sudan. And as its name suggests, this selection is made from a local landrace in South Sudan's Boma Plateau, which would be home to one of the remaining indigenous Arabica coffee forests. Kept alive as a genetic donor, Sudan Rume is a low-yielding plant regarded for its high sensory quality, though it also has been noted to have moderate resistance to some diseases. Generally speaking, it's not very common to find this coffee grown in a commercial setting, but it is used frequently. For example, Batian, Castillo, Centro Americano, and Ruiru 11 are all hybrids that include Sudan Rume's genetic contributions. While Yemen does have a Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation, its efforts have not been focused on coffee cultivar breeding. Thus, the vast majority of coffees grown in Yemen are considered land races that were selected at some point in unrecorded history from Ethiopia and then eventually evolved on the Arabian Peninsula independently. Both Typica and Bourbon trace their lineage here, but you won't find most Yemeni coffee farmers calling their trees by these names. Rather, local land races typically take the name of the region in which they're grown, such as Udain or Bura. Mocha, depending on any one of the many cognated ways that you could spell it, became common parlance for coffee from Yemen in European countries, probably beginning around the 17th century. And this, of course, creates a lot of confusion because there's also a distinct variety, also known as mocha, which we'll cover in mutations category a little bit later. However, mocha coffee of Yemeni origin was not a botanical term, but rather a misappropriation of just one of many port cities on the Arabian Peninsula through which the trade of coffee flowed. It did become a metonym for the commodity quickly, despite the fact that no coffee actually grows for cultivation in the port of Mocha. Typica, Arabica's first commercial variety to leave the Arabian Peninsula, traces its lineage to an unknown landrace in Yemen, which grew and evolved there after originally arriving from Ethiopia sometime after the middle of the 15th century. Typica was selected, taken to India either by the Indian Sufi pilgrim Baba Budan or by the Dutch Merchant Peter Venderbroek frequently receives credit for snatching a tree from Mocha and bringing it to Amsterdam's botanical garden around 1616. Um, in either case, Typica stopped over in India first, one way or another, and then the Dutch took it from Malabar to Java at the very end of the 17th century. The first attempt in 1696 failed after flooding killed the seedlings, but the second attempt succeeded in 1699. And then after its introduction in Indonesia, it thrived globally almost exclusively for about 150 years, making its way all around to the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The Dutch brought a Typica tree from Java to Amsterdam's botanical garden and gave another to the French royal court. These trees ended up populating the Western Hemisphere as well, first landing on the islands of Martinique and Haiti and on the coastal colony of Suriname in and around the Caribbean in the first quarter of the 18th century, and remained the sole American variety until the middle of the 19th century. Morphologically, Typica is a conical tree with narrow leaves and long, narrow berries and seeds. Some growers list Jamaican Blue Mountain as a distinct variety, but genetically it's actually identical to Typica. In Mexico, for example, the local Typica is often called Pluma Hidalgo. Bourbon is Arabica's second globally cultivated variety, and like Typica, it was selected from a Yemeni landrace. France began looking to their island of Bourbon, which is now known as La Réunion, for coffee planting and obtained about 60 trees from their agent who was stationed in Mocha, who happened to be in the good graces of the Yemeni court. You'll recall that there was an export ban on viable coffee seeds from Yemen at the time. On September 25th, 1715, these trees were delivered to the islands and only 20 survived the journey. By 1718, just one of those original trees remained, but colonists managed to plant 117 of its seedlings, and by the end of 1719, there were a few hundred trees thriving on the island. Bourbon would evolve there almost exclusively. This new variety, other than the beans exported to France for consumption, remained confined to the island until the middle of the 19th century. It was first brought to Brazil in 1859 and quickly gained popularity because it was more productive compared to that country's Typica trees. And a lot of sources actually speculate now that Brazil's famous yellow Bourbon cultivar, which was first reported in the 1930s, in fact, a cross of Typica and Bourbon. Standard red fruit Bourbon trees made progress through the Americas, in many places replacing the original Typica fields that had grown there. French spirit missionaries from Bourbon also took the tree with them to Tanzania's island of Zanzibar and to central coast town of Bagamoyo in 1868. From here, Bourbon trees would disseminate throughout East Africa, evolving into numerous local iterations and selections there as well. Bourbon trees generally are rounder and shrubbier in appearance than Typica. They have broader leaves and produce more spherical and less ovoid seeds and fruits. So now let's move on to some selections. These would be systematic and intentional botanical choices that are generally reproduced for distribution. Gesha, with or without the I, begins its story somewhere close to the town named Gesha in remote western Ethiopia's Benchmaji zone. British agents picked and transported coffee from the forests around Kaffa to Kenya in 1931, and then seeds from these trees were sent to Uganda and Tanzania in 1936. The second expedition and collection was made that same year as well. British botanist T.W.D. Blore, based in Kenya, notes the tree's long, drooping primaries, prolific secondary growth, small, narrow leaves, and bronze tips. The seeds then made their way across the Atlantic Ocean to the Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education Center, abbreviated CATIE, in Costa Rica in 1953. Researchers there targeted the selection for its resistance to coffee leaf rust. Catie's elevation is quite low, however, around 600 meters above sea level, and planting there and shortly thereafter in Panama, which was brought by an agent of that country's Ministry of Agriculture, was largely abandoned due to low productivity and poor quality. I would say that it's probable that the cultivar is fairly fickle and that its best attributes tend to be highlighted by a combination of elevation, rainfall, soil, and nutrient composition, and many myriad of other factors, environmental and horticultural both. In any case, it seems that the quality that it's recognized for now wasn't apparent at those research centers in the 50s and 60s. Interestingly, recent genetic testing by World Coffee Research provides evidence that there are many Geshas growing that are not a genetic match to the original Kati sample. That sample is labeled T2722 and is commonly referred to now as Panama Gesha due to its meteoric rise in prominence on the fields of the Jaramillo plot of Hacienda La Esmeralda and Boquete, which first recaptured international attention at the Best of Panama auction in 2004. I'd suggest that it shouldn't be all that surprising to hear that there are genetic discrepancies in Gesha seedlings. Looking back at the cultivar's history, multiple different collections were made in the field, so different trees were selected, and many different research centers beyond those mentioned here have their own collections since the 1950s. Gesha was also gathered very near the heart of wild Arabica's naturally diverse origin, and so I guess it should come as little surprise that not all Gesha trees are a perfect match to each other. At any rate, Gesha has invigorated the industry and placed a benchmark for cup quality that's not easily matched by other cultivars. In 1911, one of coffee's earliest known rust-resistant selections was made on the Dodinguda estate in Mysore, India, from a single typica tree that showed an uncanny ability to withstand the fungus. Named Kent, the surname of the man who discovered it, the cultivar became popular in India, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, all of which are British colonies at the time, in the 1920s and 30s. And it was an early ingredient in resistant cultivar recipes, most notably contributing genes to Jember S795, which is still planted widely in Indonesia. However, in the 100 or so years since its selection, Kent has lost its resistance and is no longer considered well suited for the virulent strains of rust fungus that have emerged in recent decades. The variety Java is a little bit of a confusing addition to this list. Java is a selection from one or more Ethiopian landraces. Some early Ethiopian accessions made it to Java in the 19th century, but the best records indicate that what we know as Java today was selected from a few mother trees in Ethiopia by the Dutch coffee researcher P.J.S. Kramer in 1928. He sent seeds to Java, where the plants flourished and showed resistance to leaf rust where other Arabica varieties had faltered. To this day, in Indonesia, the cultivar is often referred to as Abyssinia or as cognates Abyssinia or Abyssini, the name of Ethiopia at the time. To further complicate matters, I've seen Abyssinia applied to a grade or a region rather than a cultivar in some places like Sumatra, which means that you might be getting a Catamore labeled as Abyssinia because it was well sorted, for example. Nevertheless, true Abyssinia Java cultivar was eventually taken from Indonesia to Cameroon and introduced into Central America as well. It bears morphological resemblance to Typica, but the fact that its provenance is more direct, in that it was selected directly from Ethiopian mother trees in the early 1900s, makes its origin story similar to that of Gesha. The SL group listed here are three of the cultivars that we'll be covering amongst a myriad of different trees that the Scott Laboratories developed. These classic Kenyan specialty selections were made by Scott Agricultural Laboratories in the 1930s. Scott Labs, which is of course the abbreviation SL, were established in a building formerly used as a sanatorium and a hospital in the town of Kikuyu, which was a stop along the Mombasa Railway just north of Nairobi. Named for Dr. Henry Scott, the Church of the Scotland Mission in 1913, in 1922 it became an agricultural facility after a prominent agricultural supervisor relocated from Kibete and transferred resources from Nairobi. Coffee research, however, was not integrated at the facility until 1934. In the 1960s, Scott Labs was folded into the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization and thus is no longer known by that name, though its work continues to this day. There are many SL coffee breeds, but the two most popular in Kenya are SL28 and SL34, though SL14 is widely planted in Uganda as well. Many of the varieties were developed with the intention of improving resistance to drought. SL28 predates the coffee sector's moves to Kikuyu, selected and released as early as 1931 from a bronze-tip Tanganyika, which is now known as Tanzania, drought-resistant variety. That selection was first made by A.D. Trench the Kenya colony's senior coffee officer, who also released his own Kenya-selected varieties in the 1920s. SL28 was lower yielding and less resistant to disease than intended, but it did achieve a really high sensory quality, which explains its ongoing popularity. SL34 is a Kenyan selection from a single tree observed in Kabete in a field labeled as French Mission, which were presumably Bourbon trees. It's a little bit more productive than SL28 and a little bit better suited for planting in lower elevations. Like SL28, its new growth is also bronze-tipped. World Coffee research indicates that the genetic testing of both SL14 and 34 suggests that they're actually closer related to Typica than Bourbon, meaning that the French Mission anecdote might be incorrect. Well, mutations are technically selections as well. A lot of these different types that we're going to cover in the next section are traceable to specific morphological changes, which would be both significant, observed in the field, and then isolated and reproduced. One of the most common and most popular mutations in coffee is the short stature caused by dwarfism. A Brazilian contribution to Arabica's American catalog, Caturra is a single gene mutation of Bourbon, first reported in 1937 along the border of Minas Gerais and Espírito Santo. Its primary mutation characteristic is its short stature, which allows for denser planting and easier picking. These are the two most important reasons of why it's so popular. It's a parent of both the Katsuai and Catamore group. Not alone in its short stature mutation, Caturra shares genetic similarities with a number of other dwarf Arabica varieties, including Pacas, a Bourbon mutation first described in 1949 in El Salvador, which is named for the family that owned the farm on which it appeared. With Maragogipe, Pacas is a parent of Pacamara. Pache is a Bourbon mutation that was first noticed in 1949 in Guatemala. And Villalobos, a Typica mutation, and Villasarchi, a Bourbon mutation, were both reported in the 1950s and 60s in Costa Rica. Villalobos is not as commonly seen, however Villasarchi is very popular as a parent of the Sarchamore group. Like the dwarf mutations that result in uniquely compact conical trees, the Mocha cultivar and Laurina are genetically very similar, though they do have some morphological differences. What they share, however, is pretty remarkable. Both mutations contain very low amounts of caffeine compared to traditional Arabica trees. Mocha itself is a small conical tree with very tiny cherries and round seeds. It seems likely to be a Brazilian mutation like so many others. Brazil also long transshipped or wrongly labeled some of its coffee as Mocha, as in the port of origin in Yemen, which further obfuscates an already befuddling distinction. Yet it's very likely that as a result of its name, the Mocha cultivar gained more global popularity than Laurina. Laurina trees, which you can see on the right in a grove on Café Granja La Esperanza in Valle de Cauca in Colombia, and also on the right of the figure on the left of the screen, compared to the far left tree, which is a more traditional Bourbon. Laurina, also known as Leroy, which might be the name of the person who selected it, as well as Bourbon Pontu, which literally translates as pointy Bourbon. The name Laurina actually probably stems from the resemblance of the tree to the bay laurel, which would be the source of your soup's bay leaf. Laurina evolved independently on the island of La Réunion, formerly known as Bourbon, and the source, of course, of the Bourbon legacy variety. The tree is conical and emits very pointy seeds. These phenotypic expressions might lead you to believe that the tree is in fact related to Typica somehow, which is a claim that's actually perpetuated by an important genetic academic research which was published in 1951 called simply Advances in Genetics. Others have proposed that it might have be the result of a hybrid with the locally indigenous Café Mauritiana, which also assumes a conical shape and has low caffeine, a pretty logical assumption. However, recent genetic testing has confirmed that Laurina is in fact nearly identical to Bourbon in every way. So researchers have concluded that the single surviving tree that spawned La Réunion's population had embedded in its genetic code a recessive trait that emerged spontaneously on the French-occupied island in the Indian Ocean. Compared with the dwarf Arabica varieties, Maragogipe, sometimes spelled with a Y instead of an I at the end, represents the other side of the mutation spectrum, at least when it comes to size. The spontaneous Typica deviant is giant. its tree and its fruits and seeds being about twice the size of the average Arabica. This gigantism, however, is combined with some less desirable attributes like slow cherry maturation, low yields, and a reputation for slightly inferior quality. It takes its name from the town Margogipe in Bahia, Brazil, where it was first discovered. With Pacas, it's the other parent to Pacamara. Let's move on to hybrids, which are perhaps the most complex and in some cases most interesting options for coffee growers. These would be either spontaneous natural crosses or lab-engineered mashups of different varieties, in some cases even different species. By far the most important hybrid in the collection, even if it's not the most tasty, would be the Timor hybrid. After the Eastern Hemisphere's coffees began dying in droves in the late 19th century, smitten by the first global coffee leaf rust epidemic, Robusta was introduced to the islands of the Pacific Ocean. The improbable occurred on the island now known as Timor, split between Indonesian sovereignty and that of the independent nation of Timor-Leste. There, Arabica spontaneously crossbred with its Robusta, creating a new interspecific hybrid. Arabica and Robusta's union is a singular and unusual feat due to the fact that the tetraploid Arabica, that means that it has 4 sets of chromosomes, in theory shouldn't be genetically compatible with its diploid ancestor. Robusta is acknowledged as one of Arabica's parents, the other being Coffea eugenoides. In a sense, you could consider this hybrid a kind of backcross, 100,000 years in the making. Regardless, the Timor hybrid, often called Tim Tim and sometimes simply abbreviated HDT for Hybrido de Timor, became a regional favorite shortly after it was first observed in the early 20th century. It now provides the baseline genetic material for many disease-resistant Arabica cultivars, the most common of which are collectively referred to as catamores and sarchamores. The first of many iterations of catamores was created in Portugal at the Centro de Investigação de Ferungas de Cafeiro, that's CIFC. What they did was they created a hybrid from a hybrid. They took the Timor hybrid, that Arabica robusta cross, and crossed it again with Caturra, the dwarf Bourgogne mutation, and then introduced it to Brazil for the first time in 1967. There are many strains of catamore that have been created since with different individual parent plants and generational selections. Thus, catamore refers to a group rather than a distinct cultivar. Popular catamores might include Costa Rica 95 and Cat 129, both of which are trees that retain Caturra's short stature while improving its leaf rust resistance and yield. Similarly, Sarchamore is a group rather than an individual genetic selection. The Sarchamore group is a cross of Via Sarchi and the Timor hybrid. Among the more popular are Iapar 59 and Obata, first bred for resistance in Brazil, but in separate laboratories. And another one might be Centro Americano, an F1 Sarchamore hybrid crossed with Sudan Rume for quality. Despite their Robusta heritage, both Catamore and Sarcha groups are classified genetically as Arabica and are widely planted throughout the entire world. Kenya's Ruiru 11 belongs in the Catamore group, technically, but I've singled it out here for a couple of unique characteristics. Although it's considered an F1 hybrid, it's actually quite a bit more complicated than a cross of just 2 parents. Ruiru's 11's father and mother were both complex hybrids, using varieties including SL28, SL34, Sudan Rume, a couple of Bourbon selections, and a number of Catamores, with the intention of achieving a blend of coffee berry disease resistance, compact stature, high yields, and cup quality. In Ruiru 11's case, it's actually entirely appropriate to specify the parent gender for a very practical reason. Pollination between the 2 complex parents of Ruiru 11 occurs manually. The recipes for creating the father and mother are distinct. The tall tree is always bred as the male, donating pollen to the female, which is bred to be short in stature. The seeds that grow from this process are non-uniform and are blended and distributed as a composite cultivar. Named for the research station in which it was bred, Ruiru faced 2 major challenges after its release. First, manual pollination makes breeding really time-consuming, and supply failed to keep pace with demand. Secondly, with regard to cup quality, sweetness and character were actually overlooked in favor of characteristics of acidity and body, and thus specialty coffee cuppers frequently rate it lower compared to SL28 and SL34. As a response to this, Batian was released in 2010, using Ruiru's same genetic material but with a focus on cup quality and a short span between planting and harvest. Incredibly, most Batian trees have a sizable fruit load by their second year and a full harvest at year 3. Batian was selected from F5 generations of Ruru parent material that omitted the dwarf characteristics. The name Batian was taken from the highest peak of Mount Kenya, itself named for a prominent Maasai leader. In Colombia, a 6-cent per pound tax on exported coffee funds the FNC, the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros, one of the world's largest and most high-profile coffee organizations. Laser focused on improving volumes and prices countrywide, the FNC has been developing and releasing productive coffee varieties for decades under their Senecafe Research Division, which was established in 1938. Using the baseline Catamore recipe, that is, the Timor hybrid crossed with Caturra, as a blueprint, Senecafe first created the Colombia variety as an F5 composite and released it in 1982. Seeking to improve on flavor, Típica and Bourbon replaced the Caturra element in a cross known as Tabby, which was released in 2002. While Senecafe's early rust-resistant varieties were long-standing and somewhat popular alternatives to the country's aging stock of Típica and Caturra, Colombia captured the world's attention in 2005 with the release of Castillo. That cultivar is now the most commonly grown coffee plant in the country, thanks in part to heavy marketing, national taste competition victories, and subsidized seed pricing. Castillo's benefits include high yields and disease resistance, but its reason for existence is its multi-line composite of F5 generation breeding that allows for genetic diversity sufficient to resist rust and other diseases holistically within a single field of trees. On a typical monoculture Caturra farm, for example, the increasing likely event of a strain of Super Roya, the entire field would succumb to such a monstrous predator. However, only part of the Castillo grove would be susceptible because, despite being 100% Castillo, there's actually 5 or so thoroughly unique genetic composition in every bag of seeds. Additionally, Castillo has been divided into 16 regional quality variations, in addition to a general profile. Senecafe has now released an eponymous cultivar known as Senecafe 1, which stays true to the Catamore composite multi-generational selection formula. This newest release meets or exceeds Castillo cup scores and yields with the added benefit of improved CBD resistance and larger screen size, which should result in more Supremo grades and higher prices for producers. After Bourbon was introduced to Brazil, it eventually cross-pollinated with Típica, producing a naturally occurring hybrid which was first observed in 1943 in São Paulo state, also known as Mochiana. 2 separate selections were made for distribution, the most recent in 1977. Mundo Novo is a tall tree with good yields, but its range is mostly confined to South America. Catuai springs from a Brazilian cross of Mundo Novo with yellow Caturra. It retains the short stature of its Caturra heritage and is resistant to wind. It was developed in the 1940s, but not released into the public domain until the 1970s. It's a quite productive tree, but it does require a little bit above average in terms of the amount of fertilizer to maintain that productivity. Pacamara is a distinctly Salvadoran cultivar, released in the 1970s but worked on for more than 30 years prior to that at the genetic department of the Salvadoran Institute for Coffee Research, also known as ISIC. Despite accounting for less than 1% of El Salvador's coffee plants, Pacamara has developed a cult following among specialty roasters. Interestingly, the quality report that accompanied its release recommended processing it as natural for best results. It's an odd hybrid. Pacamara's parents are the dwarf Bourbon Pacas and the giant Típica Margogipe. Pacamara retains the large leaf and bean size of Margogipe. In the photo here, we see Monica Valdivieso and her father Ricardo standing in the midst of a Pacamara tree on their farm, Finca Leticia, in El Salvador. The last cultivar we'll cover today is Jember. Known by a plethora of names, including S795 and also Linnaeus, the S just standing for selection, Jember is widely used in Indonesia. Jember is the name of a regency in East Java and also the location of a research center through which it was distributed, but the cultivar was actually developed in India. It's a resistant hybrid in the style of Catamores, but with a unique twist. It's a cross of Kent, the Típica selection, with a hybrid called S228. S228 is a spontaneous interspecific hybrid of Arabica and Liberica. Liberica is a species that exhibits very large leaf and seed size and is highly resistant to most diseases to which Arabica is susceptible, making Jember also a disease-resistant cultivar. While the words, photos, and informational graphics in this presentation are my original work, I wouldn't have been able to create them without relying on a number of external sources. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge Roast Magazine's online resource, Daily Coffee News, where this work was first published. Lily Kubota and Nick Brown have been generous with their time and energy and have made excellent editors to my work. This piece, as well as many others which first ran in DCN, can also be found republished with permission on the Royal Coffee blog. Finally, you can also see listed here a number of sources, either quoted directly or referred to in citation throughout the piece, and I'd encourage you to check them as additional resources. They're all interesting in their own right. You can, of course, always visit royalcoffee.com and check additional resources there, whether it's crown jewels or information on the crown itself, or our blog for further information and educational materials. And you can always come visit us at 2523 Broadway, or email us at info@royalcoffee.com, or dial the number below to get in touch. Look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.